Shalom, and welcome to the Parasha Pod. I'm Rav Mordechai Rosenberg, here with Rav Menachem Leibtag, and we're talking Torah together. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, it's time to learn.
Double Parsha.
Double Parasha this week, we're doing Parashat Achrei Mot-Kedoshim. There's a lot going on. Achrei Mot's got the service of Yom Kippur, then we've got information about various animals and sacrifices, laws about blood, then we've got the laws that connect to sexual behavior. And in Kadoshim, we've got the command to be holy, and then a whole bunch of random laws about various things. And once again, we've got the appearance of the arayot, the sexual laws.
Repeat it again.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with the laws of Yom Kippur. Very detailed. You know, after the death of Aaron's two sons, they come into the Holy of Holies without permission. So they tell us, okay, if you want to come into the Holy of Holies in the right way, this is what you got to do. But only at the very end of a fairly lengthy and detailed chapter does it actually tell us that this is what you do on Yom Kippur. It starts out by seeming as if you theoretically could do it any time, and
that's the famous Gra, I think, who claims that Aaron could do it any time, but you have to do it on Yom Kippur, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
But you could read it differently.
Right.
I want to take your question, sort of flip it around.
Right. So my question would be just, why is it phrased that way?
Because if I look carefully, back in Parashat Tetzaveh,
Yeah.
before Chumash tells us the story of the golden calf, it's already with putting the Mishkan together.
Yeah.
Remember, we had all the psukim. Remember, we did Trumat Tetzaveh.
Yeah.
Chapters 25 through 29 were all the vessels of the temple and of the tabernacle, how to build it. Ending with, remember, beginning with Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti. You know, build it and I'll dwell there. And after it's finished, it says v'shachanti. No, it's in. I'm going to set aside. I'm going to sanctify what you built, and then I'll dwell there.
Yeah.
And after the whole theme of Shekhinah is over, we have the Mizbach Ktoret.
Right.
Remember, the whole unit's over. Oh, then we have the incense altar.
Yeah.
Sort of as a follow up, and we try to explain that the incense altar is all about kapara, and kapara means protection from the Shekhinah.
Right.
And that's why it was that's what it's following. Now, at the end, at the very end of Parashat Tetzaveh, like chapter 29, I think verse 9 or 10, it says, once a year, this Mizbach Toret needs a special sprinkling of blood from Dam Chatat Kippurim. So the concept of once a year purification of the temple is already before the sin of the golden calf already. So notice, the idea that once we have the Shekhinah, once we have God's presence with us, once a year I need to renew that connection. So I want to relive the Sinai experience once a year. That's for sure. Now, once a year, the temple needs sort of a re-cleansing, a restart, which makes sense. It's our yearly cycle. Most things work that way. Now, the question is, what's the best day of the year to do it? Now, if you follow the korbanot of Yom Kippur, we talked to this when we studied Parashat Shmini, the basic format of the high priest bringing a chatat and olah, that duo, that's called the korbanot that prepare you for encountering God. And then the people bringing a chatat olah happened first on the 8th day, and that's the day when God's Shekhinah returned, which makes perfect sense now. But now that they built the Mishkan, then God's willing to bring His Shekhinah to dwell. And because God's Shekhinah is dwelling, right, I need a ritual of kapara, because so that God's Shekhinah shouldn't be too dangerous, sort of to protect us. It doesn't guarantee protection, but it provides protection. If you still misbehave, like Nadav Avihu, it still won't help. But they were mistaken in bringing Torah for the wrong reason. That's a little too complicated for now. But I want to go back to the idea of Yom Kippur. Is that once a year the temple needs to be reinaugurated. What's the best day of the year? So Rosh Chodesh Nisan would be a great date
because that's the time when we got.
We got our first mitzvah. That's when we left Egypt.
Right.
At the beginning of the spring.
And that's also when the Mishkan was.
That's Yom HaShmini on Rosh Chodesh Nisan.
Right.
So logically, if we did it every year, Rosh Chodesh Nisan would make sense. I could do it maybe on Shavuot, when when we got the first Luchot. Now, it turns out that Chumash decides, when are we going to do this? Once a year. The best day to do it is on the day that enables this encounter to survive, which is Yom Kippur, the 10th of Tishrei, which is the day we got the second Luchot. Now, the second Luchot, remember, we renew the brit with God's attributes of mercy. What enables the Jewish people to encounter God and remain His people, even though we're a stiff-necked people, even though we're an Am Kshe'ora, right? God's attributes of mercy. And because encountering God is dangerous, as we know, and I need the most protection on that day, the best day to do this inaugural ceremony is on the anniversary of the day that we got the second Luchot. Because that's the logical reason for Yom Kippur. Why is there a holiday on the 10th of Tishrei called Yom Kippurim? Moshe goes up to pray, after the sin of the golden calf, Ulai achapra bat chatchatchem. The whole concept of kapra, protection from the Shekhinah. God says, if I dwell with you, I'll kill you if you misbehave. And Moshe demands, come with us, even though we're a stiff-necked people.
Right.
And God says, okay, I'll do that.
And find a way to not kill us if we make a mistake.
If we make a mistake, but give us a chance to learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
And therefore, what enables our encounter with God is God's attributes of mercy. And therefore, the best day of the year to have this yearly inauguration of the temple is the safest day of the year, which is Yom Kippur. Now, if you look carefully in verse 29 in chapter 16, it says, "Vaytazot lechem duchukat olam." Now, it's after we have the whole thing, the whole ritual of all the korbanot and all the sprinkling, etc. Then we're told, as a sort of a postscript that you mentioned, this is for you a chukat olam. Okay? In the 10th month, and the 7th month, on the 10th day of that month, tanu nafshotechem. We talk about basically fast, etc. Okay, and don't do any work. Okay? And then we give a reason why. Kiva yom hazeh chaper le'metayrechem. Because this day is special because this gives you protection. B'kol chatotechem lifnei Hashem titaru. Remember, that's a pasuk we quote all the time. Now, is that key? Is Chumash explaining why I'm doing the avodah or why I'm doing the avodah on Yom Kippur? You understand? The way I'm reading the pasuk is we do this once a year. At the postscript is why am I doing this on Yom Kippur? Because Yom Kippur is the best day to do it. Okay, the best day to re-inaugurate the temple, which has to be once a year, is on that day. If you look at the last line of chapter 16, it repeats, we do this once a year, without mentioning Yom Kippur. Mm-hmm. Again, the very last line of the chapter, we have that same idea.
Right. So
my point is that once a year I need to re-inaugurate. The best day to re-inaugurate is on the 10th of Tishrei. But I'm not doing it because it's Yom Kippur. I'm doing it because the temple needs to be inaugurated once a year. The best day to do it is on Yom Kippur, which is the anniversary of the second Luchot.
Right. Fascinating. Can you envision, or even do you know of any exceptional times when somebody would have done the Avodah of Yom Kippur not on Yom Kippur?
I don't think anything's ever recorded of that happening.
Mm-hmm. What about, let's say, when there's the plague and Aaron runs out with the Ketoret? Is that like an example of something like that, or not?
That's outside. He brings Torah to protect the people from right. God's wrath.
Right.
That's why that proves that Ketoret doesn't kill people. Mm-hmm. It protects people from the Shekhinah. Right. Now, it doesn't protect people who aren't worthy. And that's how people got confused. Mm-hmm. Because when none of them knew, they brought something asher lo tzibah them. God said, here's the protocol, and they broke protocol. Yeah. So it didn't work for them. But they thought it was a good idea. God's very strict on those things. Right. But Aaron has to prove to the people that because remember when Korach brings Koret, they all die. Mm-hmm. So it looks like Koret's like this magic killer. Yeah. So Aaron has to prove to them that Torah can save people, and it's your actions that cause the death, not your.
I see. So the whole point of the way that the Avodah of Yom Kippur, the service of Yom Kippur, is described, is to say, this is a once-a-year thing. It's not just about the fact that we had the Egel HaZahav and we sinned so terribly, but we need to rededicate ourselves, re-inaugurate the Mishkan, sort of protect ourselves from our own sins once a year, and then we need to think of a date for that.
Which is why we have Rosh Hashanah right before Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is remembering God's our boss. Mm-hmm. Not that God exists, but He's our boss. That's we say Shema. Machuyot is not that God exists, but rather we know He exists, but we accept upon ourselves to serve Him. We're His employees. That's Kabbalat, accepting the yoke of heaven. Mm-hmm. So before Yom Kippur, I dedicate one day, the first day of the month, to remembering our commitment to be God's people. And what enables that commitment to remain eternal is God's attributes of mercy, which is Yom Kippur.
Nice. Okay.
Which, if you paid attention in our prayers, that's what our prayer service is all about, is remembering that God can forgive. That they will forgive, but He can forgive. Right. And I can learn from my mistakes. That's why tshuva has come together with it. You don't just recite the 10 to 13 attributes of mercy. They cause you, if you understand them, they'll cause you to learn from your mistakes and grow from them.
Very nice. Okay. So another part of the service of Yom Kippur that goes on in our Parasha is the mysterious ceremony of the two goats, the Seir LaHashem and Seir LaAzazel, the one for Hashem and the one for Azazel. So my question is, what is going on with these two
First,
goats?
I want to talk about the animal itself. Why is Seir?
Yep.
All through Chumash, now there's a classic Korban Chatat, so that if someone sins, depends on who you are, etc. The Tzibor, the nation of Israel, right, brings a Chatat on every Rosh Chodesh and all the holidays. It's in Parasha Pinchas. But whenever the nation of Israel brings a communal Chatat, a sin offering, it's always a goat. It's always a Seir. It's always a Serizin.
Hold on. My question is, there are other times that other people bring other animals, right?
Yeah, a Kohen, if he sins, he brings a par.
Right.
A nefesh, a simple person, brings the kisba or seira.
Okay.
But dafka a seir, a male seir, a serizin, in my opinion, it's all based on the story of Yosef and his brothers. Because that story is the classic example, par excellence, of what called sinat chinam, baseless hatred, which there's always good reasons for. If you follow Jewish history and current events, there's always good reasons for baseless hatred. And the brothers were sure they were doing the right thing. Remember, only afterwards, oh my gosh, 20 years later, they realized what we did was terrible. It's called Asham, recognizing your guilt. But to remember the message of that story, not to cover up that story. Rather, I bring this here to remember what I learned in Sefer Bereshit about Yosef and his brothers, about the dangers of Sinat Chinam. And therefore, whenever the Tzibor gathers together, we need to do something symbolic that reminds us, beware of Sinat Chinam. And boy, is that important.
Wow. So we bring the Seir LaAzazel at the time when the community is
not just Seir, any Seir, the Seir Chatat.
Seir LaChatat.
Now there's another question. No, I'm mentioning first, why is the Korban Chatat, indoors or outdoors, in or out, is always a Seir?
Yeah.
On the holiday, everything, because of Yosef and his brothers.
Yeah.
Not to atone for their sin, but to learn from their sin that we shouldn't sin.
Right.
Remember on Yom Kippur, in that famous feud, so the 10 martyrs, they didn't die because Yosef and his brothers sold, but because of what Yosef and his brothers did. Peter is saying the rabbis are being punished at the end of the Second Temple period, or in Bar Kokhba revolt, because they didn't get the message of Yosef and his brothers' story. That's what the feud is about.
Right.
You don't punish people thousands of years later for someone else's sin, but if Chumash gave us that story, so that we shouldn't do Sinat Chinam, right? And if you didn't understand the message of the story, then you get punished because you were warned. Now, there's another question, why an outdoor? Which is totally unique, unheard of. In fact, right afterwards in chapter 17, don't even think about it. Remember, don't bring...
Right.
Now, in general, all the korbanot in the temple are for shogeg, unintentional sin. You don't do something knowing it's wrong, I'm doing it anyhow, and then bring, ask for clemency, by doing some kind of ritual. Mezid, intentional sins, it's out, doesn't belong in the temple. And therefore, you can't come to the temple if you did something mezid. And interest. Now, the only time the Torah allows some type of ritual for intentional sins is once a year on Yom Kippur, and that animal outside the temple. So the main thing is I'm sending it away. It doesn't even say to throw off a cliff, it's just send it away. Our custom is to throw off a cliff because we don't want people worshiping it afterwards. But Chumash just says, send it to Azazel. The Mishnah talks about we threw off a cliff and everything,
Right.
And that's a rabbinic interpretation of where we send it away to and what we do with it. But it's not your it's not the normal korban. So once a year on the special day, you know what God says? I'll give you a chance to start over again, even for things you did intentionally, like clemency once a year, but only once a year. And therefore, symbolically, I take another seir, send it away, because it's mezid. It doesn't belong in the temple.
Right.
And therefore, the person sending away, he becomes tameh. Because outside the temple. Because in general, there shouldn't be any ritual outside the temple. Because right away, what's the next topic in chapter 17? Remember? If you're going to eat an animal,
right,
and if you're going to bring a sacrifice, it's got to be only in one place.
Right.
Because Chumash, surprisingly...
It seems like it's considered murder if you don't.
Yeah, it's as though you committed a murder. Because what right do you have to kill an animal for no reason? Because Chumash is fighting sacrifice. It's not proliferating sacrifices. it's Chumash is given at a time when everyone brings sacrifices. It's idol worship, but people think you can buy off gods by feeding them,
Right.
like you can buy off humans.
Right.
So there's all these different powers. I'll bring them, I'll feed them, I'll praise them. Now, that's antithetical to Chumash. Chumash says God judges you. There's one God judging you based on your deeds. If I'm going to bring a sacrifice to a ritual, it's to remember that God judges me based on my deeds.
Right.
So I need to do something, and therefore all the animals are going to be representative of stories in Chumash that say actually the opposite. So we'll have we sprinkle blood of parim, like we sprinkled blood of parim of cows at Har Sinai when we said Nasa V'Nishma, when we accepted the Torah.
Right.
When Avram makes his treaty with Avimelech, he brings 7 lambs. So those 7 lambs might represent that idea. The Ayolola for the Akedah. That reminds us of the Akedah story. All the stories in Chumash give the background to the specific meaning and purpose of these animals. But the goal of the animal is not to feed God. The goal of the animal is to wake ourselves up. And that's why the rabbis understand, we put the last chapter of Hosea, Unshama Prim Spatenu, instead of bringing animals, we can pray. Because even the goal of ritual sacrifice was the thought that it brings, the transitional understanding, the transformative understanding that shapes how you behave. And therefore, Chumash is fighting the idea that I can bring an animal and get clemency for my sins, or get absolved for my sins. But you bring sacrifice. That's why all the Nevi'im fight that idea to the point that God takes away the temple.
There seems to be a kind of a practical step after this to explore, which is, do you think that eating meat per se is bad if it's not in the context of a sacrifice?
That's what Chumash says. That's exactly what Chumash says. If
So
you can eat an animal and you don't use that animal to remember that you're B'Tselem Elokim. Remember Shofech Dam Adam Badam. If you spill the blood of another human being, you're responsible.
Yeah.
Ki B'Tselem Elohim, because God made man in His image, and respect that. Now, if I start eating animals, then I kill an animal, I kill other humans. In other words, it can lead me to murder. Therefore, God says, if I'm going to kill an animal to eat it, I can take that experience of killing an animal to eat it and remind myself I'm different than an animal because I'm B'Tselem Elokim. And therefore, I do a ritual to take the act of eating an animal to elevate myself, to remember I'm different than animals, and God gave me creativity, and I have to act accordingly. And that might explain why, why. But if you don't do it in the right context, it's though you did shfichut damim.
I see. So,
that's why in chapter 17 we talk about the prohibition of eating blood, and you're chayv karet, you're cut off from the people of Israel. Blood becomes very symbolic of life, and the meaning of life, and the purpose of life.
Right. There's a lot about blood in the Parasha.
And therefore, it's a symbol of life. You don't eat blood, you don't touch blood, you don't stay away from it.
So you're saying that is all about valuing life.
Yeah, it can't be that the main commandment, as soon as God gives us the right to eat animals, right afterwards he says, but you can't kill another human being, and then says, Shofech dam adam ba'adam dam yishafech. See the word dam? Shofech dam ha'adam. Remember, adam, adama, adam. Ki b'tselem rimasat adam. That's chapter 9 in Sefer Bereshit, verse 6. The famous Noachide law. It's the main Noachide law.
Right.
So therefore, blood becomes, in all cultures, blood is always a symbol of life, of commitment, of life. There's more of a symbol of death more than life. Because you have any living thing, even the mammal, you stab it, blood comes out, and it dies.
Right.
So it's a symbol of life and death and our mortality.
Nice. All right. So the next topic in the Parasha is the topic of the arayot, the sexual
forbidden relationships.
And there's a long list there about who a person's not allowed to have.
Yeah, pretty much we call it incest. It's usually within the family.
Right. But what are we supposed to take away from this? One thing that you can notice is maybe it's connected to Yom Kippur. We read this bit on Yom Kippur. Another thing you could think of is that it's connected to Eretz Yisrael. The Parasha seems to link it to Eretz Yisrael. What are we supposed to take away from this list?
The laws of Arayot don't stand alone. They're introduced. I think the most important part is I'm not going to talk about those specific laws itself, but how they're presented. Because up until chapter 17, from chapter 1 to 17 in Vayikra, it's all about the Mishkan, about who can come to the temple, what you do when you come, what the workers do in the temple, how to bring korbanot, what you can bring, when you bring, what you're obligated to bring, what you voluntarily can bring, how to bring them, And then we had the inauguration ceremony.
Yeah.
Who can come to the temple if you become tamei? How do you become tahor so you can come to the temple again? And then the highlight is Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol goes to the Holy of Holies on Shabbat Shabbaton. That's the highest moment, and we're reliving Mount Sinai again in our commitment to be God's people. And then laws about not bringing korban outside the temple.
Right.
Everything through chapter 17 is all about the Mishkan.
Right.
In chapter 18, we leave the Mishkan and go to the land. It's our day-to-day behavior. It begins with an opening set of laws. Remember, it says, don't follow, right? Don't go in the chukim of the mitzvah. Remember, don't live like not because they're non-Jews, but because their culture is disgusting.
Right.
And therefore, don't act like the Canaanites. Don't act like the Egyptians. You saw how they behaved. Their culture was corrupt.
Right.
And therefore, don't act that way. Instead, follow my laws. Et mishpatai tasu. Keep my mishpatim chukim.
Right.
And that's the way you ban down. And if you do them, then you'll stay alive, etc. That introduces the second half, because from chapter 18 on, almost all the laws focus on our behavior outside the temple.
Right.
All the way ending with Parasha Bahar B'chukatai with laws of Shemitah and Yovel and Kimucha Chicha, helping, making sure people own land and don't have to sell themselves into slavery or mortgage their property and things like that. Laws about, Kadoshim Tiyus, all about day-to-day life and how to behave. So, in my opinion, it's super important in Vayikra, because the goal of coming to the temple is to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So the transition in Sefer Vayikra from Mishkan, from what's happening in the temple, what's happening outside the temple, that transition is in chapter 18. I think that's why we read it on Yom Kippur at Mincha. Because Yom Kippur, again, my whole point is the goal of coming to shul or to the temple is to leave.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be a transformative experience. Remember what your relationship with God is about. That has to affect your day-to-day behavior. And therefore, after we encounter God and remember that we're Mamlechet Koni V'Goy Kadosh, the commitment we made at Har Sinai to be a nation representing God, therefore, Kedoshim Tiyu, act accordingly. Right. And they bring examples of how you have to behave because you're Kadosh, all examples of the Ten Commandments, in Parasha Kedoshim. You have all the applications of it.
Right.
Some are like word for word, like, honoring your parents and not stealing, but instead of saying Lo Tirzach, instead of saying thou shalt not murder, it says, Atamot Adam Recha, don't be an innocent bystander. Notice, I can take the Ten Commandments and expound upon them. I can say don't steal. I can also say return a lost item. That's
right.
Not stealing, but I can take the Ten Commandments, especially the second half, and turn them into principles and apply them in day-to-day life. And that's what Parasha Kedoshim is doing. That's why they're sort of, the Ten Commandments are sort of hiding there. Mm-hmm. Some are pretty obvious, but some you have to look for. Mm-hmm. But how to apply that in your day-to-day life. Yeah. And that's important because that's the goal of coming to the temple is to leave the temple and live a meaningful life.
Yeah.
I think we can apply that to if I'm taking the employee model, I'm going to the temple to remember I'm an employee, then that's why we go to shul and that's why we pray. And the goal of, prayer is what happens when you leave shul or when you finish davening, right. How that affects your day-to-day life. And therefore, I think we can learn a lot from that transition in Vayikra, because people get so hung up in consumer mode. Oh, I'll go to the temple and ask whatever I want.
Right.
And I got this magical God and I can, say these magic words and I'll get help. That leads to idol worship.
Right.
But it's very different than, praying to remembering what your life is about.
Mm-hmm. Nice. All right. So you mentioned briefly the next major topic, which is that Parashat Kedoshim is about the requirement to be Kadosh, to be holy. So last week we looked at what it means to be, Tuma and Tara, what it means to be theoretically pure, or what we discussed then. What does it mean to be Kadosh?
Well, you picked a good point, because from chapter 19 on, from Kedoshim to you, the word Kadosh is like over the book.
Right.
It's rarely mentioned beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of chapter 11, it's remember Kam Kadosh Ata, when it comes to laws of kosher meat, or what you can eat, what you can't eat, the animals. But there's no doubt, that it's heavily weighted. The word Kedusha is heavily weighted from Kedoshim to you. Mm-hmm. And beforehand, we have a lot of Tuma and Tara, because someone who can't come to the temple, that's Tameh.
Yeah.
So when I'm dealing with the Mishkan itself, the concept of Tuma and Tara, meaning who can come to the temple, who can't come to the temple, makes sense why it's in the first half of the book.
Right.
The application of that idea, if the goal of coming to the temple is to remember you're a Mamlechet Koni V'Goy Kadosh, you're a priestly kingdom, I separated you to serve me. So if that message is internalized, when I leave the temple, then I talk about Kedusha. Kedusha is a way of life.
Interesting. So The Tumah and Tahara defines whether you can come to the temple, and that's why it's the main topic of the beginning half. And then the second half is how you leave the temple, and so
and what you do when you leave, how you apply your encounter with God in the temple to your day-to-day life. And that's how beautiful. The first chapter 18 is how not to behave, and chapter 19 how you should behave. Sumay Rabba Seitov.
Right. There's a lot of random laws there, but
the random is the beauty of it.
Go on.
Because there are only 3 times in Chumash where we have random laws about day-to-day life.
Okay.
Parsha Mishpatim, chapters 21 to 23. In Shemot, right after the Ten Commandments, which is our first sampling of day-to-day life. Mostly judicial laws and what's called Nizikin and ethical laws. Doshim Tiyu, 1 chapter, but a lot of laws over the place, all different topics, but about day-to-day life, especially gossiping and and taking care of the stranger and taking not ripping off in business and having good weights and things like that. And then the main law section, Sefer Dvarim, basically from Parashat Achrei, Moshe Rabbeinu speech in chapters 12 through 26, where there's a whole range of mitzvot, deal more with the nation. So it's super important that the laws in Kedoshim too could easily belong in Mishpatim. Some of them overlap. A lot of them could really belong in Sefer Dvarim as well.
Yeah.
I think Chumash on purpose inserts it into Sefer Vayikra to make sure that that's the goal of coming to the temple. If I have a book only about ritual and temple service, I'll miss the point again.
Right.
Now is it entered in, for some strange reason, Kedoshim 2, chapter 19, is surrounded by the Arayot. Remember, the prohibition of Arayot is first mentioned in chapter 18, with this introduction of, follow my ways, don't follow the ways of the nations. Here's what they did, and that's why I threw them out of the land.
Yeah.
Then here's how you should behave. And then I go back and bring the Arayot again with the punishment, with the death penalty.
Yeah.
And the Chazal learned from there, the rabbis learned from there that you can't punish someone unless he was warned. Yeah. So I have a whole chapter of warnings. 2 chapters later, the punishment, if you don't follow those warnings. And the rabbis build a principle that you don't punish people unless they're forewarned.
Yeah.
It's called Einon Shin Elin Kemasirin, which if you live in Sechet Sanhedrin, boy, that gets us out of trouble. Like to convict somebody, do you realize what you're doing is wrong? Are you sure you're doing it anyhow? You have to really be lazy to be punished by Beit Din for a capital offense.
Do you buy the idea that was always the case, or do you think that's like kind of a rabbinic change?
I think the rabbis are. I'll give you an example from here, because if again, Kedoshim 2 is surrounded by Arayot, but it's surrounding it and it's highlighting it. That's the center of the book. Kedoshim 2 is mamish at the center of Vayikra. It's also pretty much the center of Chumash, which is like beautifully placed. And there's sort of a chiasm that not only there we have it's a little complicated for you need a blackboard to show that the whole book has a envelope structure. But the it's idea of 7 and 8, 7 days in Miluim and the 8th day, and you have that on the holidays in Emor with 7 and 8 and things like that. Again, you see how it gets complicated, but it works beautifully. The book begins with a korban adava that a person brings, and the book ends with someone offering himself, not just an animal. His value. It's called erchin. There's the book has a beautiful envelope called chiastic structure. Now, but smack in the middle of that is Kedoshim Tiyu, which is super important. Now, when it comes to punishment, capital punishment, there's a lot of capital punishment with Yom. But notice, I'll quote, who is it? Gideon's father. Remember when Gideon broke the idols? They want to kill Gideon, right? What does the father tell them? If this God's so great, why doesn't he do it himself?
Right.
In other words, what gives you the right? What gives one group of human beings the right to enact capital punishment for an offense against God? Now, if someone does something to society, if you kill your fellow man, steal, that's called nizikin. The judicial system every society has. So humans can punish other humans for breaking civil law. That makes sense. It's all based, that's Locke and Hobbes, that's class in law school. But what gives us the right to punish a person for breaking a law against God? Now, unless you're representing God. If you're godly, in other words, the prerequisite to be able to enact punishment, you have to be Kadosh. Of course, if you're Kadosh, you're not going to be doing those things. But that's why, when I take the word Kedusha, if you look in chapter 20, when we have the punishments, the whole punishment section is surrounded by Vitem li Kedoshim ki Kadoshani.
Right.
Vikadishim vitem Kedoshim. It's like I'm surrounding death penalty. I'm inserting the idea of Kedusha, which wasn't mentioned with the warning, only with the punishment. So I'm saying, if you're going to punish somebody for an infraction against God, you have to be godly.
Right.
Then because you're representing God. But we're never at that level. So basically, I think the rabbis apply that in Masechet Sanhedrin, that to actually go and kill somebody, almost impossible. Remember, the rabbis say once every 70 years would be called a severe court. If they, again, that's for laws between God and man.
Right.
The man and man, that's a different story. That's for a nation to be civil, you need to enforce the law.
I see.
But a person needs to know you deserve to die. Mot means you deserve to die. So that's what you need to know. To go and do, you know how dangerous it is to kill people for religious sins? Read about the Inquisition.
Right.
You know, that's
So how would, just to go back to the previous question, how would you translate the word Kadosh? You know,
Kadosh means to separate, even in a negative way. A Kadesha, remember in Bereshit, someone separated for harlotry. You know, you're separated for a certain purpose.
Wasn't that like a holy harlot in a way, like a
No, a Kadesha, because in the temple they had a harlot. You know, that's how they got people to come to shul. You come to our temple and you get to have an orgy in our temple, and that will bring rain. That's Baal worship.
Well, there's also the kind of the fertility aspect of it.
Yeah,
right.
That's classic idol worship.
Right.
Now, Kadosh means separated, and we have separation in the realm of time, in the realm of space, in the realm of matter of people.
Right.
So, but whenever we have separation, it's always for the sake of God. Right. God's going to separate one day of the week. First topic, chapter 1 of Bereshit. They'll separate one day of the week and make it special. But the goal of making one day special is to become the funnel to bring God into every day of the week.
Right.
God will we have 12 tribes. God separates the tribe of Levi, gives them the special job to be officiants and educators and work in the temple. But for the sake of the other 11 tribes.
Right.
There's 70 nations, figuratively speaking.
Yeah.
God separates one nation to be the funnel to bring God to all those nations. And God separates one land, or one place, Yerushalayim makes it special, to bring God to outside Jerusalem. One land for God to emanate to all the lands. That's the base idea of Kedusha, which it's separation for the sake of God, but to have an effect on the group I'm separated from.
Right.
Now, God Kadosh, that means something. God's separate from His creation, and He created. It's like your neshama separate from your goof, but no, it's something. God is totally separate from His creation, is created, sort of anti-Spinoza. No, it's not. God isn't the sum total of nature, but God is separate from nature, yes, and He made nature. He made our creation, but He's totally separate. I think that's what Kadosh, and boy, He's separate. Kadosh, like totally separate, like Kadosh, 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 like what Isaiah.
He's totally separate, and yet He created it for, and his separateness from the world is sort of serves the world in the same way that Shabbat.
Yeah, and He made man. We don't know why, but that's what He did, and we serve Him.
Right.
But we have to act accordingly.
Right. And that also means to be separate from other nations, and
but it's separation. It's particularism for the sake of universalism, right? I'm separating myself not because I am better. I need to be better,
right? But
I'm taking myself responsibility to be a model nation for other nations to learn from. I'm not demanding respect. I'm not demanding privilege. I'm demanding upon myself responsibility, and I take upon myself that responsibility to serve God.
Amazing. Wow, thank you. We've covered a lot of ideas, and
double Parasha. We went double time today.
Yeah, appreciate it,
okay.
And thank you everyone for joining us, and wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. Like, subscribe, share with your friends, and have a great week.